Hey guys, well, we're back at Stellies, although the classrooms and hallways are still pretty empty. I know most of you are carrying on with your work at home. We are jumping into our final unit, which is the Kingdom Plantae. So we've moved through a number of kingdom already. We are leaving out Kingdom Fungi, just for the sake of this year being a bit of a weird year. And so this is where we're going to wrap things up. We're going to wrap up plants with a little chat about the non-vascular plants, and then finish up next week with the vascular plants, and that'll be it. We're going to start today with some characteristics of plants generally and the ways that we classify plants, and then we'll jump into our first phyla, which is phylum Bryophyta. So we're going to come back to this little chart often. What you'll see here is the way that we're dividing up plants on the basis of their characteristics, and then these terminate in the group name. So Chlorophyta is an algae, and those are classified within Kingdom Plantae and kind of Kingdom Protista. They are a bit of a mixed bag there. And so we're not going to talk about those because we covered them already with the protists, but they are there because they are the evolutionary ancestor of all modern land plants. So those are the green algae. Also in this group of non-vascular plants are the bryophytes. Those are things like mosses, hornworts, and liverworts, and that's where we're going to start today. As we move through Kingdom Plantae, we're going to be looking for evidence of how these plants have changed and evolved to arrive at the very large, complex plants that we see now, like the trees around us, gymnosperms. Those would be things like cedar and pine trees, and the flowering plants, which you probably have lots of examples of those out in your yard right now. Things like a cherry tree, lilies, and roses are all very successful on land. So as we go through the different groups, you're looking for evidence of what has made these plants so successful in a terrestrial environment. Plants all originated in aquatic environments, so they are the evolutionary descendants of the green algae, those protists. Once we get to a true plant, the taxa, or the groupings, are divided on the basis of the presence of vascular tissue. Now, vascular tissue are cells and structures that are developed to transport water and nutrients around the plant. We also divide them on the basis of their reproductive structures. Are they using spores or seeds, cones or flowers? And then whether or not they are gametophyte or sporophyte as their dominant generation. We'll talk about what that means in relation to reproduction. So here we are again. All of those plants, from bryophyte all the way up to our dicots and monocots within phylum Angiospermae, are eukaryotic, which means they have cells that have organelles and a nucleus. They are all non-motile in the main stage of their life. They some have a swimming sperm, but the plant, animal, or organism itself doesn't move. Plants also have cell walls that all contain cellulose, and this is a defining feature for plants. So a rigid outer structure that gives shape and form to the cells and also helps in maintaining their water balance. All plants reproduce using alternation of generations. So this is something we have seen already. We know that things like our cnidarians, those jellyfish that flipped back and forth between our polyp form and our medusa form, right? They alternated between those sexual and asexual reproduction and body forms. Plants do the same thing. They alternate between what we call the sporophyte generation and the gametophyte generation. And so that's found in all plants. All plants we know are autotrophs, so they obtain their energy through a process known as photosynthesis, and they rely on chlorophyll as their primary photosynthetic pigment. And so plants typically have chlorophyll A and B, both as the way that they trap the energy from the sunlight, and then that is converted from solar energy into chemical energy in the form of sugars within an organelle called the chloroplast. So this process of photosynthesis, we've seen before, and we'll see it again, it keeps coming up, but it takes carbon dioxide out of the air, combines it with water, and using the energy trapped in light, solar energy, and the pigment chlorophyll as a catalyst, it converts the chemicals in carbon dioxide and water into glucose and oxygen and water. Now, glucose is what the plant actually needs. That's the energy source that can then be used in our mitochondria to produce energy in the form of ATP. Oxygen and water are thankfully byproducts that are then released out into the atmosphere. And as humans, as animals, we are using that oxygen as part of our respiratory system. Now, plants have evolved, as we mentioned, from the plant-like protist, the single-celled algae, and the multicellular green algae, like those green seaweeds, are thought to be the ancestor to our modern terrestrial plants. And so our trends in plant evolution is adaptation to life on land. The reason that land is an ideal place for a plant is that there is no water blocking sunlight filtering down. We know that light, solar energy, travels through air much more easily than it does through water. And so being on land provides plants with much more energy access from sunlight. But there are some challenges. Primarily, drying out is the issue. We know that our algae have very thin tissues and they dry out very, very quickly. We call it desiccation. And so plants needed to adapt adaptations that allow them to prevent desiccation. It also takes away the buoyancy of water. Living on land means you have to support your structure upright towards the sun without the support of water helping you to float. And so plants have developed structures that help with that. Plants also relied on motile sperm swimming through the water. And if you're living on land, water isn't always available for the sperm to swim from plant to plant. And so they had to develop a system or a method of way of getting around that. Respiration, allowing gas in and out of their tissues without losing water in the process. Required nutrients like potassium and nitrogen are very easy to get out of the water, much tougher to get in a terrestrial environment. And so plants had to deal with that. And we also know that the water is a really great way of maintaining a steady temperature. And on land, our temperatures can fluctuate quite a bit from season to season and even from nighttime to daytime. And so plants have had to come up with some creative ways to survive and thrive in a situation with all of those challenges on terrestrial life. So we mentioned alternation of generations, and here is a little generalized life cycle. We'll see this in more detail as we go through the different groups of plants, but typically all plants have a life cycle that contains 2 generations. A sporophyte generation, which is a multicellular diploid. And diploid, remember from genetics back in grade 9 and grade 10, just means that there are 2 copies of each chromosome. That sporophyte generation is the result of development from a zygote. So after fertilization has occurred, that's when we start our sporophyte generation. The zygote develops into a plant structure that is sporophyte, which then undergoes meiosis and produces haploid spores. Remember that meiosis is reductive division. So we're cutting the number of chromosomes in half. Each of those pairs are being separated to opposite sides, and will end up in opposite cells, spores in this case. Those spores then develop into a gametophyte, which is then the structure that produces the gametes, either eggs or sperm. So the dividing line, if you're confused on a diagram, look for the places where fertilization is happening and where meiosis is happening. That's the big divide. It's not always a 50-50 split. Some plants are dominant in the sporophyte generation, and some plants are dominant in the gametophyte generation. So first we're going to jump into our bryophytes. So these are non-vascular plants. They are the simplest plants, the first foray onto land, and they include the familiar mosses, which we have lots of around here, and also things like liverworts and hornworts, which we do have around here, but are probably a little less familiar. Though once you have learned what they are, you may notice them out and about as you're enjoying the forest around Victoria. So here we are, we're talking about bryophytes. Chlorophytes are also in this group, but that's a protist-like plant sort of overlap. And so here's where we're jumping in. So we've got here our liverworts and hornworts, and typically these are sort of flat or fleshy, it's called a thallus, structure on the surface of the ground, and a hornwort has these skinny projections that poke up that look a little bit like blades of grass, but they're a bit fleshier. And then of course moss, I'm hoping, is very familiar. I went outside the door of my classroom and found some here for you. We've got lots of moss around, and so those are the bryophytes. These are the first land plants, and they are non-vascular, which means they don't have any way of moving water from the environment up and down the plant. So they rely entirely on diffusion to transport materials. And for that reason, they are very, very small. They do have root and stem and leaf-like structures, but because all of those structures are lacking vascular tissues, they're not true roots, stems, or leaves. They have no transport system. And so they're very small, and they must stay in damp or shady environments close to the ground or close to whatever they're growing on, maybe the side of a tree or a building, so that they can maintain their water just by diffusion. So those are the ways they've adapted to life on land. They are small. They live in moist habitats. Their tissues are very thin to allow for diffusion, movement across membranes very easily, and they tend to grow in clumps to help hold the moisture in. What's working against them, why these aren't the most successful plants, is that their sperm still do require water to swim. So their sperm needs to get to the egg through swimming. They have no vascular tissue, so no way of transporting materials from parts of the plant, and they have no roots for absorption or storage of water. But they are still a very important species and prolific. They are often considered a pioneer species, so one of the first steps in ecological succession. So after an area has been cleared, either through human activities or environmental disasters, forest fires, mudslides, mosses and bryophytes are often the first plants to show up there and start to colonize the soil, break down the rock, and create a habitable environment for other organisms. They are primary producers, like all plants, which means they're producing oxygen and are the first step in all food chains. They are a prime habitat for invertebrates. We know that mosses are a favorite home of the tardigrade, but lots of other critters live in the moss. And they are also useful in maintaining moisture in the soil. So if you've been doing any gardening during closure, you may have mixed peat moss into the soil to help hold on to moisture. Mosses really do act like a sponge. And so when you mix it into your soil, it helps your soil to retain the moisture. Now, the anatomy of a sponge, and there is a diagram that you're going to be labeling. You can come back to this to help you figure it out. The sporophyte and gametophyte are actually part of the same plant. And so the gametophyte develops out of the spore, so the spore will germinate, and then this gametophyte is the green part of the moss. And so if you're picturing moss in your brain, probably what you're picturing is the gametophyte. And we say that the gametophyte is the dominant generation because that's the site of photosynthesis. It's also where we find the gamete-producing structures. In a moss, those are called antheridia and archegonia, and they're up here at the tip of the plant. And once the sperm swims to the archegonia, which is where the egg is found and fertilization occurs. Fertilization results in the growth of a sporophyte. So this stalk and capsule lift up above the base of the plant, so they're up in the air to help fling those spores. And that's where the spores are going to develop, is inside that capsule. So gametophyte is the green part, and the sporophyte is the sticky up part. So if you go outside and take a look at some moss, you probably have some somewhere in your yard. You can see these little sticky up parts. That is the sporophyte growing off of the base, which is the gametophyte. This little video, I will not play it here because it's going to be part of the Edpuzzle assignment that comes with this unit. It's only a minute long. It's really quick, and it's going to walk you through labeling the diagram that's attached to these notes. You won't be doing this poster. You're just going to be labeling a life cycle diagram. Okay, and you can come back to this for help with that as well. Good luck. Hope you enjoy, and make sure you get outside and take a look for some mosses. If you haven't finished your nature journal yet, or you want to add another page, go outside and take a look at some moss. There's definitely some around your house. Enjoy.